Welcome to the webinar, Navigating Testing Requirements for 3D Printed Medical Devices, brought to you by Medical Design and Outsourcing Magazine and sponsored by HP. Just a couple of housekeeping details before we get started. You'll see several boxes on your desktop, all of which can be moved around to suit your preferences. You can enter your questions in the Q&A box, and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Another box to note is the additional resources box where you can download the slide deck for today's presentation. Your speakers for today's webinar are David Johnson, Dawn Lissy, and Meredith May. I'm Danielle Kirsch, Senior Editor of Medical Design and Outsourcing and Mass Device, and I'll be your moderator. And without further ado, I will hand the presentation over to our presenters.
All right, thank you so much, Danielle. So I appreciate everyone's time joining. These webinars have been fun to do, and this one I think will be no different. So we are looking at navigating testing requirements for 3D printed medical devices. This was actually the #1 poll answer from our last webinar. So thank you for all those who attended and gave information. What we're looking to do is taking a role to identify the appropriate tests for your medical device. We have both mechanical and biocompatibility testing explanations that we'll dig into a little bit deeper for each, and then also how to find the right partner when you do get to the point of testing. I'm very excited to have the Empirical team with us today, but just to give a little background on myself before I have Dawn and Meredith introduce themselves. I'm the application engineer for HP. I cover the Midwest Territory and live out of Chicago. I have about 5 years of additive experience being with reseller startups, and I've been with HP for about 1.5 years with mechanical engineering background, and have been diving deeper into the medical device area for about the past year. So Dawn, if you would like to introduce yourself and also just give a little bit information about Empirical.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and present this information today. My name is Dawn Lissy, and I started in the orthopedic industry designing spinal implants. About 3 years into that, the company I worked for was purchased. So I saw a need for mechanical testing and started Empirical Technologies. We're rounding the corner onto 25 years. We've been providing mechanical testing head to toe, minus cardiovascular, for that entire time. And about 12 years ago, Meredith joined our team, and she'll talk about what she did there. But we also offer consulting services for regulatory quality systems and validations. I worked for the FDA as part of the Entrepreneur in Residence program in 2012 and 2013, specifically addressing Class 3 devices and how to have a template and have transparency about what the process is. So that was an exciting opportunity as well. I love education, and one of the things that we've at Empirical have done for a number of years is actually looking at the hows, the whys, and the whats of additive manufacturing since about 2015. And so we have done a number of studies, which we'll talk about a little bit later today. And this is an exciting field.
Hi, I'm Meredith. I've been with Empirical, like Dawn said, for about 12 or 13 years, something like that. Prior to that, I was actually a customer of Empirical when I was working for a spinal implant company as a vice president of everything. During that time of being in a startup, I had to learn to do all of the other stuff besides the manufacturing and design engineering that I had done the first 15 years of my career. So after learning to deal with all of that stuff, I called up Dawn and I said, there is so much more that needs to be done for regulatory filings, including regulatory filings. I think that it'd be a great idea to expand your business for your clients to be able to offer a lot more services. So that's kind of what we put together. I have now become certified quality auditor, certified in RAC. We do quality systems regulatory filings of all sorts, mostly Class 2. And I will be graduating with my law degree next year, and so we will also be adding additional services at that point.
All right. Very impressive, both of you. Very excited to dig into each of your little subsections. So one thing before we get started, for the audience, we'll be talking with Dawn for about 20 minutes and then Meredith for about 20 minutes. And an important thing, just so we understand the audience and can kind of talk in the correct terms, if you can fill out this poll. We just want to know your background, so whether you're on the medical practitioner side, manufacturing, design, biomedical engineer, other, so owner, regulatory, consultant. It's important just so as we keep these webinars going, we're making sure we're addressing the correct things in your specific field. So I'll give that about 30 seconds. And Dawn, as you mentioned, kind of seeing an opportunity many years ago. What has shifted, say, in the last few years? You know, additives become more of a production aspect with 3D printing. How have you seen things change, and you know, where do you see there's still gaps that you're trying to solve with Empirical?
You know, that's a loaded question, but I appreciate that. So, you know, part of what Empirical is partnering with our clients. We consider ourselves part of their team, right? And so with that, we're trying to stay ahead of or current with what is the thinking, what are the questions, how do we best serve our clients and make sure that we're addressing all concerns, risk analysis, quality systems, you know, and that's part of that partnership with Meredith of offering, once your design is complete, all the components that you need to get to a clearance or approval with the FDA. You know, when I started designing spinal implants, for instance, sterilization, cleaning, dry time, all those validations, that was I promise that we will do this after we get clearance from the FDA. And now it is a requirement ahead of time. So it used to be that mechanical testing was the last thing that was done. Everything was compiled and then, you know, put to the FDA. And now when we work with clients, we talk about, hey, listen, we need to, you know, especially with an additive manufactured device, that cleaning, packaging, all those post-processing aspects have to be addressed. And some of those tests take longer than the mechanical testing part. And so that's probably one of the most unique thing, is just sort of that paradigm shift of what does the product development cycle look like, and what are all the attributes that you have to take into consideration so that you have good convergence and understand the milestones to get to submitting to the FDA.
Yeah, definitely a loaded question, and a great answer with kind of working with your customers. So the poll results are shown. So similar, we have a little more practitioners than our last webinar, which is great, but still high amount of manufacturing and biomedical engineers. So thank you, audience, for putting that together. So we will be focusing right now with Dawn on the mechanical testing side. We have some exciting things, and those of you with the last webinar, this was a chart going over just the classifications. We won't dig into the explanation. Michael Drews in our last webinar did a very deep dive into what those look like. So at the very basic level, Dawn, what changes when you look at mechanical testing for a class as you go up from a class 1, 2, all the way to 3? You know, it's a higher risk profile for the type of claim, but what needs to be there as far as like mechanical testing on the actual like part design?
Sure. So at a simple level, class 1 is really anything that comes into contact with the human body and then goes away. So any mechanical testing that we may do for a class 1 device usually lands in the arena of a marketing or a white paper or answering specific questions around that technology. It is the least common amount of testing that we do. For class 2 devices, you have to show that you're substantially equivalent to something else that already exists on the market. And that measure of safety and efficacy is the actual mechanical testing. So in the substantial equivalence table, there's 12 or 13 different types of things that you have to show substantial equivalence. Mechanical test results, which include static and dynamic testing to an ASTM or ISO standard about a specific device, always occurs for a Class 2 device. A Class 3 device, it is the safety measure to ensure that the device is safe to go on to clinical trials, which is the measure of efficacy in a Class 3 device. So that's where mechanical testing happens. So a bulk of our product is Class 2 devices, but we love seeing Class 3 devices. We're very active with new technologies that don't have an ISO or an ASTM standard and developing specific protocols to identify failure modes and longevity of the device so that we can present that information to the FDA or other regulatory agencies to show safety and efficacy.
Gotcha. So, and that's all on a kind of level playing field. And we've had our discussions before. In some stakes of additive as end-use parts for, let's say, production, it can be treated the same, but when it comes to actual mechanical testing, why would there be different testing requirements, with 3D printing versus, say, something that was created that used to be CNC? What are we trying to prove there in that instance?
Sure. So from a fundamental standpoint, the substantial equivalence bar for any type of device doesn't matter from the FDA standpoint if it's additive or subtractive manufactured. The difference comes in, so historically, the way that the FDA looks at it is if you have a family of products, for instance, trauma screws, right? So you have different diameters and different lengths. If the product development engineer identifies what of that family of products, the geometry that represents worst case for that family, then that's the only size that we need to test to show that it's met the bar of substantial equivalence. When we get into additive manufactured devices, we have that same sort of thing, and we'll use FEA or finite element analysis to determine what represents worst case for the family, because these geometries are getting more complicated and more complex, and it's not as easy to just do a cross-sectional area or an engineering analysis. So we'll do an FEA analysis and we'll run static tests in our lab, and we'll do a comparison and validate the FEA model. And that serves two purposes. It shows that we have correctly identified what represents worst case, but then it also allows our clients to go make parametric changes on their design to see if those changes improve or take away from the performance of the device itself. So this is where we use FEA. When we have additive parts, now you can manufacture complicated and complex geometries. There's a lot of science around having a titanium end plate to your device for bony ingrowth, so that's a benefit. But when we start doing mechanical testing, now we're looking at how do the failure modes change, both on a static aspect. How do we hold the devices and not cause failure with the test block? So we've actually had to change our entire mechanism for holding medical devices so that the test blocks aren't causing failures. That's not something that we've had to do in the past for subtractive devices. And we have to do a lot more evaluation of what kind of failures happen, or was it something that actually existed in the device before testing happened, right? So we're trying to eliminate all the variables and correctly characterize the device. The other thing that comes out with additive manufactured devices are patient specific. So that's different than a special and a custom. We're looking at geometries that have a volume and shape that is patient specific. So now instead of looking at what the worst case size is and just testing that, now companies have to decide, and we work with our clients on this, what is the minimum footprint, minimum volume, and basically you're now characterizing the corners of the sphere that the patient-specific device can be printed in and making sure that that's safe. And so that can be anything from temporal, mandibular, cranial devices. I know that interbody fusion devices are patient-specific. and I know that we're moving down through all the joints. And so there's a little bit more effort, not just one single battery of testing meeting the criteria of substantial equivalence, but really looking at what's the maximum volume and minimum volume with footprints attached to it to make sure that anything printed inside those constraints are going to be safe. And so that's the biggest difference between a subtractive device and an additive device.
That's it. So when it comes to patient-specific, and this is where I think additive is going to be a key role just because it can be adaptive.
Yep.
As far as like the duration and maybe like monetary value of testing, what are you typically seeing if you had, say, like a standard product medical equipment device that's going to be the same mass-produced testing versus something that is more patient-specific?
So it still follows, again, there are ASTM and ISO standards that are specific to the type of device. So for instance, if we talk about a spinal cage or IBFD device, that is ASTM 2077, ASTM 2267. Those are the specific standards. So all the testing for characterization, whether it's patient-specific or just a general product line, is going to follow those specific test standards. The difference is that making sure we may test multiple sizes when it's additive to make sure that every combination of geometry and volume and footprint of the device still represents a safe and effective device per the indications of use. So, for instance, a 2077 device will take 4 to 6 weeks of testing. We can test in parallel. You test them in axial compression, shear, and torsion if it's a cervical device. We'll use multiple frames, or we'll do one size at a time, in which case, instead of 4 to 6 weeks, you're going to look at 8 to 12 weeks for testing. So that's the difference in the requirement. The other part of this, sorry, go ahead.
No, please continue.
The other part of this is that additive devices are really the only medical devices where there's a lot release criteria from a print standpoint. And that is a hot topic of conversation. So anyone that's on this call, if you are not part of ASTM, I would strongly consider becoming part of ASTM. F.42 is the additive manufacturer group. And so it's looking at all industries with additive manufacturing. But we're also, that's where we're talking about what is the lot release criteria and what defines the size of a lot and what are the criteria around a company, a manufacturing engineer or company deciding, okay, this is what we're going to test. And that's where we'll test chemical, metallurgical, powder will become part of the process. And right now it's a tensile bar that is being tested for medical devices. And so this is one of the conversations that's happening is, given that most of our devices are used in a compression manner, does it make sense to keep testing a tensile bar that's printed to show that the mechanical properties of that batch is meeting the expectation?
That makes a lot of sense. And when you spoke at AMUG, because I think that's when I was first introduced to you, you also mentioned in the lot release, there's also the aspect of recyclability in powder and how does that shift things. And I think you mentioned there's not a great solution. So companies are trying to figure out how to safely and ensuring that any mixed batches or going from lot to lot is ensured safe. Do you see any recommendations when it comes to that for the testing, that if there is like a powder-based system that does mix versus one that might do just a direct material?
I am unaware of any white papers or research that is directly addressing that and that people can say, well, this is what it says, so this is what we're going to follow. And that's where there is I should mention, so in addition to the guidance, the ASTM standards and the FDA guidance for any specific type of medical device, and again, we're talking orthopedic devices, the FDA also has, in addition, and we did talk about this at AMUG, a whole guidance document on if your device is additively manufactured and what you need to make sure you're addressing from quality systems, IQ, OQ, PQ, validations, and continuous testing. So as we talked about at AMUG, The problem with powder recycle is we're sort of learning as we go. And what's interesting is that back in 2016, when we started doing research on static properties of different additive manufacturer properties versus dynamic or fatigue performance of these devices, and then the impact of post-processing, there were only, I think, 3 types of additive manufacture machines. And now I think the last time I counted, there were 7 or 8. And so at the time that the FDA is starting to wrap their head around, okay, what does this all mean? And what are the different input variables that will impact the performance of the finished device? And how are we going to correctly apply a risk assessment to each station in printing a device? And how are we going to quantify that? And what effort does that take? And so I always joke with people that when it's a new type of technology, there's always a bell curve associated with the FDA. So more questions, more inquiry, more requirements to provide information for a longer period of time until we've answered all those questions. We saw that when PEEK, polyether ether ketone, became a material. I mean, heck, when I started designing medical implants, over 30 years ago, it was your choices of materials were stainless steel, cobalt chrome, titanium was the new hot thing, and I'm dating myself, and ultra high molecular weight polyethylene. So when PEEK came out, we did a heck of a lot more testing on a PEEK implant for the FDA and for regulatory agencies to get a comfort level around it, and those requirements have tapered down. This will eventually happen with the FDA, but because it's got to keep in coinciding with the new technologies that are coming out. So it's a constant process. That's the answer. It's a constant process.
Yeah, and I always say this, and being from a startup and also an additive, that a common quote I always repeat is, everyone wants to be the first to go second, because the first one has to go through all that additional work and effort until someone like the FDA says, okay, we kind of get it now. We can lessen some of the requirements and things like that. Okay, so we can move on to the actual testing, which I was very excited to go over this in preparation for the webinar.
Yep.
To the audience, this is a open document and testing that Empirical has done. So it is a bending test with a CNC rod and also 2 other technologies, DMLS, which is direct metal laser sintering, and then also EBM, electron beam melting. So 2 metal additive technologies, and going through the testing in comparison with all 3 of them. Dawn, if you want to kind of give an explanation as we go through this, just to give a little more details about how you approach this, why you approach this, and also some of the results which we'll have in later slides.
Absolutely. So we were looking at answering questions for folks. Well, what happens? Because one of the things that I've heard my entire career was, well, it was made to print, so it should be just fine. Well, that is definitely not true in an additive manufactured device. It's certainly not true in subtractive, but we're going to add an extra layer on here. So we, Empirical, partnered with a couple different additive manufacturers with different technologies, and we tried to simplify this experiment as much as we possibly could. So we used just a rod, and we did a 4-point bend. So we're trying to eliminate as many variables as possible. So if you want to go to the next slide, the takeaway is that from a static testing standpoint, your stiffness, your yield, and your ultimate loads, really, and you can see this in the graph that we provided, that there's really no difference from a static standpoint on the performance and material properties of the different additive manufactured technologies, as well as CNC. So if you want to go to the next slide. What gets interesting is when we start doing the fatigue testing. So we were able, this is a very busy graph, but the takeaway is that the CNC runouts, we were able to, the applied stress was, about 175 KSI. But when we started looking at different additive manufacturing for E-beam, I don't even think we were able to get a runout value. And it wasn't until we did our second study where we looked at post-processing, hipping, shot peening and some other things, and those improve the fatigue performance of the devices. But this is this is the cautionary tale of, okay, there are a lot of variables that go into something that is additively manufactured. You've got your powder, like we talked about, how many cycles recycling, what's the ratio of recycling, how are the parts laid out for print on the plate, what are the specific machine specs, and so one of the other conversations, in addition to the lot release testing, is dual source suppliers, right? So if, for instance, we used one type of machine and we had the entire process, and that's the thing that people forget, is that when you go for FDA clearance or approval, it's not the end product. It is you're freezing the entire process from the powder type, the concentration, the ratios, to the print bed, and all those things that we talked about, to the end result through sterilization and cleaning. And by the way, this is really the only industry where we care about particulate still being in the part, and that it's actually clean and sterile. Aerospace, not so much, right? So when we go through it, it's the entire process that's been frozen, and that's what has been cleared by the FDA. If you've got, if a medical device manufacturer wants to go to a different contract manufacturer, then we have to go through some additional testing to validate that new manufacturer and that process and show that there isn't a difference. But when you have all these different technologies and all these different potential variables with additive manufacturing, that's where the scrutiny in the risk assessment and the quality system requirements come into play at a much, much higher level, much more detailed, granular hows and whys when it's an additive manufactured part.
Gotcha. So this is a very, very thorough experiment. And as I mentioned, this can be available. If anyone's interested, please leave a note or reach out to Empirical or HP, and we'll help you out. The one thing I didn't include in the slide, just because I didn't want slide after slide after slide. So you mentioned doing the FDA analysis as the initial look at a design. How did the results perform from a CNC versus the two other additive technologies with the actual results of your testing?
Yeah, so from a static standpoint, they're statistically equivalent. From a fatigue standpoint, it depended on the type of technology and depended on the finishing processes, right? So we found, I believe that it was shot peening and hipping, doing both had the best fatigue performance, meaning that when we did E-beam in this first experiment, we couldn't even get a run-out value. But once we did those post-processing, it was able to at least hit about, I think it was 100 KSI with the second experiment. So definitely an impact, and definitely, this is the old adage that how you manufacture something will impact the end result.
Gotcha. And then one interesting thing I noticed, because I'm not less familiar with the technologies that you chose, but with the layer lines being kind of moving up as the rod goes, was that kind of worst case scenario planning, or obviously you would have, if it's isotropic or not, potentially different, but is that just making worst case scenario and why it was specifically designed that way?
I think at the time, I mean, again, this was back in 2016, that was sort of the simplest and least amount of impact on how to print a rod, and also did, like you said, represent sort of worst case for the geometry. Yes. Okay.
Very good. So I do want to make sure we have enough time for Meredith. So there is a question, and those of you who are asking questions will have time at the end. But this one was specific. You mentioned it a little bit in the intro, but they asked, how would a material coupon testing best be addressed for the application where there are different structures? So they might have example is a spinal implant that parts are machined versus latticed, where there might be bone contact. So how does that approach happen with the actual mechanical testing behind it?
So when we talk about a lattice structure, that's where we really had to adjust. Well, two things have impacted how we hold a device, right? So you have fixtures that have the setup that are attached to the test frame and the load cell. So that's where you're getting your inputs and your outputs. But what holds the device itself are the test blocks. And so for static testing, it's a stainless steel block. For dynamic testing, it's usually polyethylene or polyacetal. And we want to make sure that we are creating pockets that match the geometry of the device that we're testing. When we do subtractive manufactured devices, we can usually just get one fit part, and that's been dialed in, either least material condition or maximum material condition. With printed parts, that could be through the entire tolerance band. So we literally fit each device to a set of blocks so that we're maximizing the fit and not, again, creating extra stress risers in the testing. The other part, so that's how we had to change our test block design to meet that need. The other part of it is that we don't want to have the test blocks cause failure. So especially with a lattice structure, we want to make sure that we're not testing against stainless steel for any reason, which we can do for a subtractive titanium device, for instance. But with additive, we want to make sure that we're not causing stress risers. So I hope I answered your question there, but that's definitely, again, we take a lot more pictures, we do a lot more evaluation, a lot more conversation with our clients from a partnership standpoint of, is this intentional and part of the design, or is this an outcome from the testing?
Gotcha. And then I think I know the answer to this based on our conversation, also the last webinar. But are there any testing FDA guidelines for 3D printing devices for Type 2 specifically?
So you mean Class 2 devices?
Yeah, sorry, Class 2.
Okay, so really there's nothing, there's the guidance document from the FDA that talks about additive manufactured devices. That's a layer over the guidance documents that exist for the type of device that we're testing. So as long as you cover the guidance document and that references the specific ASTM or ISO standards for mechanical testing and include the guidance document on additive manufactured devices, you've covered all your bases.
All right, sounds good. So we have a few more questions. We'll get to the remaining ones at the end. So Dawn, thank you so much. We will transition the conversation to Meredith and going over biocompatibility.
Thank you.
Hey there.
Hey, Meredith. Well, now we do have a few questions there, so hopefully we'll answer them through this section. So we talked about biocompatibility from a regulation standpoint in our last webinar. What audience I know has been curious about is actually going through the testing once you kind of figure that out. But starting from a high level, you mentioned a really good point as we were preparing for this, but what do you see the best way to save time and money for the actual device testing as you're approaching it? Because obviously everyone would want things to be quicker and cheaper. What do you see being the best option as you're starting to go through this process?
Sure. So one thing to remember, and people have a tendency to forget this, is that the FDA knows that all of these materials are historically used in medical devices. So telling them that is not going to get you anywhere. They are concerned about the biocompatibility of the finished device, which would include all of the manufacturing materials, cleaning agents, and everything else. If you can leverage any 510K cleared device that was manufactured identically to the way yours is, either internally or with the same vendor that you're using to manufacture your devices, then you are able to basically make a claim that says this device is identical in form, function, chemicals. I don't know, it's a whole statement that's in the guidance document there. And that allows you basically to just ride the coattails of whatever the previously cleared device was. For metal devices, they do give you a little bit of a loophole that they didn't actually put in the guidance document, lovely, that allows you to forego most of the biocompatibility testing if you have passivation as your final step that involves chemical contact. The mistake that a lot of people make is they do passivation and then they do a final clean prior to package. And if you use, let's say, Alkanox, for example, to do your final clean, then they're going to want to know about the toxicity of Alkanox, which, newsflash, is very toxic in itself. and they won't look at your cleaning validation to make sure that you've removed all of the cleaning agents. So the best thing to do for metals would be passivation as a final step. For polymers, it's a little bit more difficult because you can't have any contact with any chemicals other than alcohol. IPA, I believe it's 97 to 99, something like that. So it's a little bit still kind of up in the air with the polymers. Although I will point out that right now I'm dealing with some issues where the FDA is concerned about the heat that's generated during the manufacturing process and whether or not that changes the chemical content at all. Something to do with crystallinity, calciums and things like that. That's way beyond my pay grade. But those are the quickest ways to kind of avoid everything.
Yeah, and then we talked about including the biocompatibility early in the engineering design. So you mentioned looking at that as a way just to claim almost an easier path, but you mentioned that a lot of companies will go through this process and then biocompatibility comes last, which can cause a lot of issues. So how, as far as like teams and managers that are on the, say, product design, how should they look at this and include that aspect in their part design?
So I was a manufacturing engineering rep on multiple design teams. And as part of project kickoff, right, we would evaluate what's going to be the processing step or how many steps, what kind of cleaning and those types of things. This really needs to be considered literally at that initial project creation step. Because when you're developing the processes that you're going to use to manufacture, they need to either be identical to a previously cleared device, or they need to have passivation at the end, or you need to budget in a lot of time and money for actual testing or further justifications that, have had some success here and there. So it's definitely something that needs to be done on the front end. I mean, the full battery of testing will take 6 months and cost $300,000 in a semi-worst case.
Yeah, and that's always the case that once people want to prevent and is preventable in some cases. So one of the things, as we mentioned, kind of utilizing some of the resources of the FDA, to your point of talking about this, so this is what HP provides as the biocompatibility on our thermoplastic side. To Meredith's point that this is not the final, end result of the product you're doing. These are samples right off the printer. There's a lot of things that can be interacted with the part if you do any post-processing, surface finishing techniques. Even the media blast can make a part that's biocompatible no longer valid. So Meredith, with taking the approach on the FDA side, but also leveraging this, what is something that would be useful but also cautious on as a company says, we need these test standards to be approved, but we haven't actually done any testing yet?
So you do have the opportunity to leverage master files that are registered with the FDA. A master file, for example, will have all of this actual testing that's been done. And so if you say the master file covers the processes up to this point, you really only have to evaluate the processes that come after that point. So if these are done right off the printer, then the question will be what manufacturing materials or chemicals are coming in contact with your device after it comes off the printer. And you're right, I mean, bead blast and some of those things can definitely have a bit of an impact, but you just have to evaluate the details of what the media is, how it's maintained, how much you're recycling it, the same kind of thing that you're having to do for your powder. As long as you have strict controls and you know exactly what's going to come in contact with the device, you should be able to write some justifications and possibly shortcut some of the testing. So some of those tests are lengthy. Some of them, like cytotoxicity, I tell people you almost just want to do it. It's a good thing to know. It's kind of the litmus test for everything else. So that's probably the best way to start the process.
All right, sounds good. And then the other chart that is pretty critical, at least on the FDA side, is this one, which is available on their website. Meredith, do you want to just explain what this is and also how it kind of can dictate, dictate the testing requirements, but also kind of the actual design planning as you're trying to see what best material to choose from?
Yes, so they have a little introduction on how to go through the chart, but basically, for implant devices that are orthopedic, you're going to look at the second from the bottom. It says tissue bone for implant devices. And then they're going to be permanent, which is C, I believe, yes. So then you're going to need to, I think it's C, yeah. You're going to need to basically take into consideration and evaluate every single one of those biological effects. You can go as deep or as shallow in this as you want. Some people will actually do chemical characterization with a test lab, which means that they pull the chemicals off of the finished good and then evaluate those chemicals to determine whether or not there are any concerns with whatever chemicals are remaining. That has to then be reviewed and approved by a toxicologist. It's probably worth your time and your money to have that done as a starting point, because that feeds very well into justifying not having to do all of those tests. And while we're on the topic of labs, we have talked about this before, the FDA has a pilot program right now. It's called ASCA, which stands for Accreditation Scheme for Conformity Assessment. Not exactly the best acronym, but it is what it is. So they are slowly working into a way to accredit test labs for specific testing, so that similar to being able to go and look and see if somebody's registered with the FDA as a manufacturer, you'll be able to go see if that lab is registered with the FDA. I think right now it's still only electronic testing, but they're working on expanding it. So in the long run, you'll be able to look there. There's also A2LA accreditation, which is what Empirical has, and some labs have that available. It's not as commonly used as it is in mechanical test labs, but it's getting there.
Gotcha. And so obviously the accreditation is going to be, I think, a first look when that does become available for biocompatibility testing. Since it's not currently, what are your recommendations when a company is looking at a testing vendor for their specific test that they're trying to complete?
It's kind of hard at this point. Like I said, there are accreditations through A2LA. There's also, I believe, some sort of European certifications. Right now, I do a whole lot of calling people and finding out, hey, how was your customer service? Because I've had fewer problems with the actual technical issues with labs. I've had more problems with lead times, poor communication, delays, and those types of things. And those are all things that are not necessarily going to be covered under accreditation. So I would say, reach out to your network and say, hey, have you guys had trouble with this lab, or what's been your experience with this? And that's probably the best way to find a lab that's going to meet your needs.
Yeah, and then do most labs cover the entire ISO 10993 standards across the board, or are some they'll only pick and choose certain ones that they focus on?
Some of them will pick and choose, particularly because of the tests that involve animals. So there's a whole different regulation to certify for animal testing. A lot of labs have chosen not to go through that, but they have contracted with these animal test labs. So most of your major biocomp labs will be able to facilitate all of the testing. They may not do it all in-house, but they'll probably have contracts with other sister labs or something like that.
Gotcha. And then I know you said there's a handful of available testing in the U.S. One of the things you mentioned was also looking internationally as far as like other options. Is that how, at what point do a company take that approach if they're not really seeing any success with what they're currently qualifying their test labs?
Well, so the Europeans have been doing this testing longer than we have. That means at this moment we're a little bit behind the curve on ramping up all of our test labs to meet these requirements. So there is something to be said for reaching out to the European labs because they probably already have it down to science, so to speak, pun intended, to be able to push these tests out faster. I think that the U.S. labs will catch up quickly, but at this point I have seen some success with the European biocomp labs. Now, one thing to think about, though, is a European requirement is for all animal testing. You can only test once. So they don't want animals sacrificed for no reason. You just need to make sure that you have your ducks in a row and that you're only going to do the testing once. You don't make a mistake like sending parts that haven't been cleaned or something and then you fail a test, and now you can't redo the testing unless you have a full justification that has to be approved by the authorities, which is a real pain.
Yep, totally understand. So we are wrapping up on the segment we were covering. We do have a few questions related to the biocompatibility side of it. The first was a question to what you mentioned of looking at 510Ks and kind of utilizing that. The question was that they're looking at a situation where it was the same device using the same material, same process, but a different vendor. Is that something that they can utilize the biotesting from that specific 510K, or would it be recommended to do additional testing just to cover your bases?
So you would need to have intimate knowledge of what chemicals are coming in contact with the product at each of the vendors. And that's where sometimes it becomes a little bit difficult. I'll have people who are trying to use a 510K product that doesn't belong to them, which means that they may not have intimate knowledge of what's being done. If you have intimate knowledge, you can have a separate vendor. You just have to analyze the chemicals that are coming in contact and evaluate whether or not additional testing is needed.
Gotcha. So if you have gaps in information like that, it's likely you'll just have to go through the testing regardless?
Yes, unfortunately.
Okay. Another question, which I have my input on this, which I would love to hear Meredith's perspective. So someone mentioned that they see a lot of custom-made devices that they'll essentially utilize the biocompatibility chart that we showed, saying that, HP did all the tests and it passed, so my device is safe. They say, does this concern you? And that we should include a disclaimer saying that you should do your own testing. So I will add, as HP side, there is a disclaimer on the footnote. It does concern me because this is a very serious regulation process. You need to do your due diligence on the biocompatibility side the same way a mechanical engineer or design engineer will validate a design from Forces. So same rules apply. I hope I don't see many situations like that. Unfortunately, I'm sure it does happen across the field. Meredith, anything to add to that specific question?
That is correct. You as the manufacturer of record are still responsible for the final product and all of its quality attributes. So you can start with what HP has done, and then you need to then evaluate further from there how it's changed specific to your device.
All right, sounds good. So I will close up the biocompatibility. Meredith, is there anything to add? Anything that I missed or question I asked that I should have asked that I didn't?
No, I think the most important thing to take away really is that you can't start this planning soon enough. Make sure that you consider this literally in your design inputs and reach out to somebody who has some knowledge and can help you finalize a plan before you move forward to final design stage, because it can impact your product design as well as your process design extensively, and of course your timeline and budget.
All right, sounds good. So to the audience, we will now go into the open Q&A. We have a few questions. I will try to grab as many as I can in our allotted time. Question to both of you, both on the, say, mechanical and biocompatibility side. What are the common mistakes approaching medical device testing? And Meredith, we can... Yeah, Dawn, we can start with you then.
Common mistakes are really not understanding the regulatory pathway, understanding the timelines and testing requirements, understanding things like, okay, what represents worst case for the family of products, because the FDA is going to ask for that justification. So if the company just picks a size and doesn't have a justification, the FDA doesn't agree, then everything that was done, you get to start over. And one of our big things that we like to work with our clients on, especially if it's a new technology or you have a new feature, for instance, having bony ingrowth end plates on a spinal implant, for instance, that's not a common thing, and there might be some additional questions that the FDA has. So we're big fans of creating protocols specific to devices that don't have ASTM or ISO standards around them, and doing a Q sub with the FDA to get buy-off on the protocol before all the testing, before you even make parts, let alone do all the testing. So understanding what testing needs exist and the timing of all those, and then the risk reward for whatever pathway or whatever tools you use. Those are the things that I think people need to consider.
Gotcha. Meredith, anything to add to that?
I would say just kind of on a high level, I know we talk about getting regulatory involved early, but I would also say that get regulatory involved and better trained in the technical aspects of a lot of this, because the regulatory people are now having to make more and more decisions that are technical in nature. So there's definitely some training that goes in there. And one of the things that we fight with the most when it comes to people who are just entering the market is this concept of, I just need an FDA certificate to sell my stuff. That's not how regulatory works. You don't throw everything at the FDA at the end and just expect it to work well. Really focus on your planning part of your design controls and your design process.
All right, thank you. The next question, I'm trying to combine a few of them to answer somewhat similar, just for the sake of time. So are there other tests to keep in mind on the biocompatibility side outside of the ISO 10993?
The other thing I will point out is the pyrogenicity requirement for sterile devices. So you have to have done your pyrogenicity testing, but then you also have to have a pyrogen monitoring plan in place for sterile devices. Not required for non-sterile, but it is required for sterile. So just make sure that you include that into the rest of your testing, like the bioburden and those other things that you were doing quarterly. That needs to be added there. And that is not material-mediated pyrogen testing. Those are two different things. So LAL testing would be your lot release type of testing, not the rabbit testing, which is material-mediated. Two separate endotoxin/pyrogen tests. You're just going to need to do the LAL, which is very quick, easy, does not involve killing rabbits.
Okay, thank you. And then what are good ways to learn more about these specific test standards? I'm someone that loves reading through these, I've gone through a bunch of them. They're also sometimes expensive to initially purchase. Are there any other recommendations that someone can educate themselves outside of just purchasing the standard?
I would say I would start with FDA guidance documents, as well as any GHTF, Global Harmonization Task Force guidance documents. A lot of those will have the high-level considerations, and they don't need to go down into the little bits and pieces of like how many hertz or what kind of biological indicator and those types of things for you to understand what needs to be done.
And then on my side, David, for ASTM, it's a fairly nominal fee to be a member of ASTM each year, and with your membership, you have access to, you designate which volume of standards. So, for instance, if you were going after medical devices, you would ask for and have access to electronically all the standards in FO4 for medical devices.
Gotcha. Are there any other organizations that people should be aware of within the regulation FDA medical device field?
I don't think so. AAMI, AAMI, ISO on the biocomp side.
Yep.
And then ASTM, obviously, on the mechanical testing side. And ASTM does have some testing requirements for chemical type testing, but very few.
All right, sounds good. So I want to make sure we have enough time to close out. Thank you for all the audience members that asked questions. It was offering a lot of good interaction and dialogue between all of us. So Dawn, I want to pull over the final few minutes to you. I know you had an announcement and then mention of like 2 trade shows you'll be at, just in case everyone that happens to be there, they can stop by. So if you want to go over those.
Well, I appreciate that, David. Yes. Empirical will be at NASS, the North American Spine Society meeting in Chicago in October. We'll have a booth there. We'll also be at ICAM, which is at the end of October into November, which is an additive manufacturer-centric meeting, and we're giving a presentation there. The other big news for Empirical is this past year, we actually joined the Family for Applied Technical Services, or ATS, which is based out of Marietta, Georgia. So now, in addition to just the static and dynamic fatigue testing, we offer the lot release testing with chemical, metallurgical, powder testing, failure analysis, CT microscanning, a number of other services through our parent company of ATS. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I always want to give my guests a time just to self-promote. And finally, to the audience, if you have the ability to fill out this poll. Last poll we did, last webinar was very valuable. That kind of gives us guidance of future webinars coming up. This will give us a little idea of additional resources that will go through. So anything to add, and you can do multiple choices of what you would like to see come out of HP to help you go through this process, make it a little less painful. Depending on the situation, maybe cut your lead time and overall costs of the approach. So appreciate anyone that can give that. As far as what's next for HP, we will have a follow-up with a link to our digital manufacturing network. So that means that if you are interested in this, aren't really at the point of getting a machine, we do have partners that can print as a service. It's a really good way to dip your toe into the water. And we will have webinars coming out in October, November. October is looking to be a customer-focused one. November, we will be looking at quality management systems. We'll have more details on our social platforms once we start promoting it. And I always like saying every webinar we've done this year is currently on demand. The last one was really good with Michael Drews on the regulation side. There's also just great content there, so feel free to look through it. It can answer a lot of your questions. And the amount of trade shows we have in October, November, we'll be at Device Talks in Santa Clara, MedTech Conference in Boston, both in October, and then it's still not finalized, but we're looking at AM Medical Summit in Minneapolis in November. So Meredith, Dawn, thank you so much for joining us today. And Danielle, I will hand off any other closing comments to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to everyone, to our presenters for your time today. It was a lot of good content. And thank you to HP again for sponsoring today's webinar. The presentation will be emailed to everyone at a later time. And I want to thank everyone again for attending. And yeah, hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining.